In the beginning, before time itself had a name, there existed only the primordial waters of none. Dark, endless, and infinite, these waters held within them the potential for all creation. From this cosmic void emerged a single mound of earth, rising like the first breath of existence itself. Upon this sacred hill stood Ra, the sun god, creator of all things, his golden radiance piercing the eternal darkness for the very first time. Ra was not merely a god among gods, he was the supreme deity, the one whose very essence gave birth to light, warmth, and life itself. His name echoed across the cosmos like thunder, and his presence commanded respect from every corner of creation. As the sun disk blazed above his head, Ra gazed upon the empty world and knew that it was time to populate the realm with divine beings who would govern the forces of nature and guide the destiny of mortals yet to come. The birth of Ra from the waters of Nun was itself a miracle beyond comprehension. From the chaos of the primordial ocean, consciousness emerged, self-aware and filled with creative power. Ra spoke his own name into existence, and with that first word, reality began to take shape around him. The sound of his voice created vibrations that rippled through the cosmos, establishing the fundamental laws that would govern all of creation for eternity. As Ra stood upon the primeval mound, his radiance began to transform the formless void into a world of substance and meaning. His tears, shed in wonder at his own existence, fell to the earth and became the first humans, fragile creatures who would worship the gods and build civilizations in their honor. His breath became the wind that would carry life across the land, while his heartbeat established the rhythm of time itself, the eternal pulse that would measure the days and seasons of all existence. With divine breath, Ra spoke into existence his first children. From his tears came humanity, fragile yet precious, destined to walk the earth and worship the gods. From his divine essence came the other deities, each bearing a sacred responsibility that would shape the very fabric of Egyptian civilization for millennia to come. The pantheon of Egypt was born not through accident or chance, but through the deliberate will of Ra, the eternal sun god, whose light would forever illuminate the Nile and the hearts of those who called Egypt home. The creation of the divine family was a complex and wondrous process that unfolded over cosmic ages. Ra's first act was to create Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. From his mouth he breathed forth Shu, who would separate the sky from the earth and provide the atmosphere that all living beings would need to survive. Tefnut emerged from his divine spittle, bringing with her the life-giving moisture that would make the desert bloom and the rivers flow. Shu and Tefnut, the first divine couple, wandered far into the darkness of the newly formed cosmos, exploring the boundaries of creation and establishing the fundamental forces that would shape reality. During their absence, Ra grieved for his lost children, and his sorrow was so profound that he wept continuously. These tears, falling upon the earth, became the first human beings, created not from clay or divine breath, but from the very emotions of the Creator God himself. When Shu and Tefnut finally returned to Ra, they brought with them knowledge of the far reaches of creation and the wisdom needed to establish order in the cosmos. Their union produced two more fundamental deities, Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. Geb lay beneath all creation, his body forming the solid foundation upon which life could flourish, while Nut arched above, her star-spangled form creating the celestial dome that protected the world from the chaos beyond. The love between Geb and Nut was so intense that they remained locked in an eternal embrace, preventing the birth of their own children, and threatening to crush all life between them. Ra commanded Shu to separate his children, lifting Nut high above Geb so that air could flow between earth and sky. This separation was both necessary and tragic, for it allowed life to flourish while condemning the divine lovers to spend eternity reaching for each other but never touching. In her anguish at being separated from her beloved Geb, Nut defied Ra's decree that she could not give birth on any day of the year. Through a clever gamble with Thoth, the god of wisdom and time, Nut won 5 additional days that existed outside the normal calendar. During these days, she gave birth to 5 children who would become some of the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon: Osiris, Isis, Seth, Nephthys, and Horus the Elder. Each of these children was born with a specific destiny that would shape the fate of both gods and mortals. Osiris emerged first, crowned with the white crown of Upper Egypt, destined to become the king of the living and later the ruler of the dead. Isis followed, gifted with magical powers beyond measure and a wisdom that would make her one of the most beloved goddesses in the ancient world. Seth came forth on the 3rd day, born from his mother's side in violence and blood, his red hair blazing like fire and his eyes burning with an anger that would never be quenched. The birth of Seth was attended by omens and portents that troubled even Ra himself. Thunder rolled across the clear sky. The earth trembled, and a desert wind arose that withered plants and scattered sand across the fertile lands of the Nile. The infant god's first cry was like the roar of a sandstorm, and those who witnessed his birth knew that he would bring both great power and great turmoil to the world. Nephthys, the 4th child, emerged as a goddess of mourning and protection, her gentle nature serving as a counterbalance to her brother Seth's chaotic energy. Finally came Horus the Elder, a mighty god of war and the sky, whose falcon form would soar above Egypt for all eternity, watching over the land with keen eyes that missed nothing. Among Ra's most cherished creations was the younger Horus, son of Osiris and Isis, the falcon-headed god whose keen eyes could see across vast distances and whose wings could carry him swifter than the desert wind. This Horus, distinct from his elder namesake, embodied the majesty of the pharaoh, the divine authority that flowed from the gods directly into the earthly rulers of Egypt. His right eye represented the sun, blazing with the power of Ra himself, while his left eye symbolized the moon, cool and mysterious in its silver radiance. The mythology surrounding Horus's eyes became central to Egyptian religious and royal symbolism. The eye of Horus, known as the Wedchat eye, represented protection, royal power, and good health. According to legend, during his battles with Set, Horus lost his left eye, which was torn from his head and scattered across the land. Thoth, the god of wisdom and healing, gathered the fragments and restored the eye, making it even more powerful than before. This restored eye became a symbol of renewal and regeneration, worn by pharaohs and commoners alike as protection against evil. When Horus spread his mighty wings across the heavens, his shadow provided protection for all of Egypt, and his cry echoed like a battle horn calling the righteous to victory. His flight patterns were read by priests as omens of future events, and his appearance in dreams was considered a direct message from the divine realm. The falcon became so closely associated with royal power that pharaohs were often depicted with falcon wings or wearing the hawk-headed crown that symbolized their divine nature. But the story of Horus cannot be told without speaking of his father, Osiris, the green-skinned god of the underworld and the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Osiris ruled as king of Egypt during the Golden Age when gods walked openly among mortals. His reign was marked by prosperity, justice, and harmony. The Nile flowed abundantly, the crops grew tall and golden, and peace reigned throughout the land. Osiris taught humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, law, religion, and the sacred rites that would ensure their souls' safe passage into the afterlife. The Golden Age of Osiris was a time of unprecedented prosperity and cultural development. Under his benevolent rule, humanity learned to cultivate the fertile soil of the Nile Valley, transforming the wild grasses into wheat and barley that could feed multitudes. Osiris personally showed mortals how to brew beer from grain, how to make bread from ground wheat, and how to preserve food for times of scarcity. His teachings laid the foundation for Egyptian civilization and established the agricultural practices that would sustain the kingdom for thousands of years. Beyond material prosperity, Osiris brought law and order to human society. He established courts of justice where disputes could be settled fairly, created codes of conduct that governed interactions between individuals, and instituted religious ceremonies that connected mortals to the divine realm. Under his guidance, humanity developed writing, mathematics, architecture, and art, creating a sophisticated culture that reflected the harmony and balance of divine creation. The green color of Osiris's skin symbolized the fertile earth and the promise of rebirth that lay at the heart of his nature. Like the vegetation that died each year only to return with renewed vigor in the spring, Osiris represented the eternal cycle of death and renewal that governed all life. His association with the flooding of the Nile, which brought life-giving silt to the fields each year, made him a symbol of fertility and abundance that resonated deeply with the agricultural society of ancient Egypt. Osiris was beloved not only by mortals, but by his divine family as well. His wife, Isis, the goddess of magic and motherhood, stood beside him as queen. Her love for Osiris burned brighter than the stars themselves, and her magical powers were second to none among the gods. Isis was more than just a consort. She was a full partner in ruling, using her wisdom and supernatural abilities to complement Osiris's strength and justice. The magic of Isis was legendary throughout the ancient world. She could heal any wound, cure any disease, and even restore life to the dead through her powerful spells and incantations. Her knowledge of herbs, potions, and sacred words made her the patron goddess of physicians, midwives, and all who sought to heal the suffering. Yet her greatest power lay not in magic alone, but in her capacity for love and compassion, which gave her the strength to overcome even the most impossible challenges. Together, Osiris and Isis represented the perfect balance of masculine and feminine divine energy, ruling with wisdom, compassion, and strength. Their union blessed Egypt with abundance and protected the land from the chaotic forces that constantly threatened to undo the order of creation. Their love story became a template for human relationships, showing mortals how partnership based on mutual respect and devotion could create harmony and prosperity. The divine couple's reign was marked by cultural and spiritual achievements that established the foundations of Egyptian civilization. They built the first temples, established the priesthood, and created the religious festivals that would celebrate the gods and mark the passage of the seasons. Under their guidance, art flourished, with craftsmen creating beautiful objects that reflected the divine order and harmony of creation. Yet where there is light, shadow inevitably follows. In the divine family of Ra dwelt Seth, the god of chaos, storms, and the untamed desert. Seth's red hair blazed like fire, and his eyes burned with jealousy and resentment. While Osiris ruled over the fertile lands of the Nile, Seth commanded the harsh, barren deserts that stretched endlessly beyond Egypt's borders. The contrast between the brothers could not have been more stark. Osiris brought life and order, while Seth embodied the destructive forces that could sweep away civilization in a single catastrophic storm. Seth's domain was the desert, that vast expanse of sand and rock that surrounded the fertile Nile Valley like an ocean of death. From his palace in the wasteland, Seth commanded the scorching winds that could wither crops in a single day, the sandstorms that could bury entire cities, and the drought that could turn the mighty river into a trickle of mud. His power was necessary to maintain the balance of nature, for without the desert's harsh challenges, the fertility of the Nile Valley would lose its precious value. The red god's nature was complex and contradictory, embodying both destruction and protection. While his storms could devastate Egypt, they also brought the rare but precious rains that could make the desert bloom with sudden, brilliant life. His association with foreign lands made him the protector of Egypt's borders, the fierce guardian who prevented invasion from the chaos beyond civilization's boundaries. Yet these positive aspects of his nature were overshadowed by his consuming jealousy and his capacity for violence and treachery. Seth's jealousy of his brother grew like a poison in his heart. He watched as mortals praised Osiris, as temples were built in his honor, and as the fertile lands prospered under his rule. The desert god's resentment festered until it became an all-consuming hatred that would ultimately tear the divine family apart and plunge Egypt into its darkest hour. Seth began to plot, his mind working like the shifting sands of his domain, crafting a scheme so treacherous that even the other gods would be shocked by its cruelty. The psychological complexity of Seth's character reflected the ancient Egyptian understanding of the dual nature of existence. Just as the desert could be both deadly and life-giving, Seth embodied the necessary but dangerous forces of chaos that challenged order and stability. His jealousy was not mere pettiness, but a cosmic force that tested the strength of divine harmony and ultimately led to greater wisdom and power for those who survived his challenges. For years, Seth nursed his grievances in secret, maintaining a facade of brotherly loyalty while his hatred grew stronger with each passing day. He studied Osiris's habits, observed his routines, and carefully planned the perfect moment to strike. The god of chaos was patient in his malice, understanding that a single, perfectly executed blow would be far more effective than open warfare that might alert his brother to the danger. The opportunity for revenge came during a great feast celebrating Osiris's wisdom and justice. The entire divine family had gathered to honor the king of Egypt, and the atmosphere was one of joy and celebration. Gods and goddesses from across the cosmos attended the festivities, bringing gifts and offering praise to the beloved ruler. The palace sparkled with divine light, and the sound of laughter and music filled the air as the celestial court celebrated the prosperity and peace that Osiris had brought to the world. Seth had commissioned a magnificent sarcophagus for the occasion, crafted by the finest artisans and decorated with precious metals and jewels. The chest was a masterpiece of Egyptian craftsmanship, so beautiful that all who saw it were filled with wonder and admiration. Its surface was covered with intricate hieroglyphs, telling the story of life, death, and rebirth, while precious stones formed constellations that mirrored the night sky. Gold leaf covered every surface, making the sarcophagus gleam like a captured piece of the sun itself. The craftsmanship of the sarcophagus was so extraordinary that even the gods marveled at its beauty. The hieroglyphs seemed to move in the flickering torchlight, telling stories of divine adventures and cosmic battles. The precious stones embedded in its surface caught and reflected the light in patterns that resembled the movement of stars across the heavens. Every detail had been planned and executed with meticulous care, creating an object that seemed to contain within itself the very essence of Egyptian artistry and religious devotion. During the feast, Seth announced a contest, declaring that whoever could fit perfectly inside the sarcophagus would receive it as a gift. The announcement was met with laughter and excitement, for such contests were common at divine gatherings, and the prize was clearly magnificent beyond compare. The gods enjoyed competitions that tested their various abilities, and the chance to win such a beautiful object added an element of playful rivalry to the celebration. One by one, the guests tried to fit inside the ornate chest, but none matched its dimensions exactly. Some were too tall, others too broad, and a few too small to fill the space properly. Each attempt was met with good-natured laughter and encouragement from the other guests, who saw the contest as harmless entertainment that added to the festive atmosphere. The gods and goddesses took turns lying in the sarcophagus, trying different positions and poses, but none achieved the perfect fit that would win the prize. Finally, Osiris himself stepped forward, his noble bearing and regal presence commanding the attention of all present. The crowd fell silent as the king of Egypt approached the beautiful chest, his green skin glowing with divine radiance in the torchlight. With the grace and dignity that marked all his actions, Osiris carefully lowered himself into the sarcophagus, his form settling perfectly into the space, as if the chest had been crafted by the gods themselves to hold his divine essence. As the god of the underworld lay down inside the sarcophagus, it became clear that the chest had been crafted specifically for him. The fit was perfect in every dimension, from the length and width to the subtle curves that matched the contours of his divine form. The crowd gasped in amazement at this apparent miracle, not yet understanding that what they witnessed was not divine providence, but the result of careful planning and malicious intent. But this was no coincidence. Seth had secretly measured his brother's body during moments of trust and intimacy, using his knowledge to instruct the craftsman in the exact specifications needed. Every dimension had been calculated with mathematical precision, every curve and angle designed to accommodate Osiris's form perfectly. The apparently generous gift was actually an elaborate trap, crafted with the same care and attention to detail that Seth had once devoted to protecting Egypt's borders. As soon as Osiris was inside, Seth and his co-conspirators, whom he had recruited with promises of power and position in his new order, slammed the lid shut with a sound like thunder that echoed throughout the palace. The sudden violence of the action shocked the assembled guests into momentary paralysis, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The sound of the lid closing was followed immediately by the hiss and sputter of molten lead being poured around the edges, sealing the chest permanently and condemning its occupant to a slow and horrible death. The shocked guests watched in horror as Seth and his followers carried the sarcophagus toward the Nile, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow of torches, and their movements swift with the efficiency of those who had rehearsed their roles many times. Some of the gods moved to intervene, but Seth's co-conspirators formed a protective barrier around the chest, their weapons drawn and their expressions threatening violence against any who dared to interfere. The procession to the river was like a nightmare funeral march, with Seth leading the way and his followers bearing the sealed sarcophagus that contained the still-living Osiris. The sound of the god king's muffled cries from within the chest haunted those who heard them, and even some of Seth's own allies began to question the wisdom of their participation in such a horrific crime. Yet fear of Seth's wrath kept them moving forward, carrying their terrible burden toward the dark waters of the Nile. At the riverbank, Seth performed a mockery of the funeral rites, speaking words of false mourning while his eyes blazed with triumph and malice. With a great splash that seemed to shake the very foundations of creation, the conspirators cast the sarcophagus into the sacred waters, condemning Osiris to a watery grave far from the land he loved and the people he had served so faithfully. The death of Osiris sent shockwaves throughout the divine realm and the mortal world. The sun seemed to dim as Ra himself grieved for his murdered descendant, and the light that fell upon Egypt took on a gray and sickly hue that reflected the cosmic imbalance created by Seth's crime. The Nile's waters grew dark and stagnant, refusing to flow with their usual life-giving force, and a great mourning fell upon the land of Egypt that affected every living creature, from the mightiest lion to the smallest insect. The natural order that Osiris had maintained began to crumble in the absence of his guiding presence. Plants withered in the fields despite the season. Animals fled their usual habitats in confusion and terror, and humanity wept for their beloved God-King, whose protection they had lost. The very foundations of civilization seemed to shake as the laws and customs that Osiris had established lost their divine sanction and authority. In the temples throughout Egypt, priests struggled to understand what had happened and what could be done to restore the balance that Seth's crime had destroyed. The sacred flames that had burned continuously in honor of the gods flickered and dimmed, and the oracles fell silent as the divine communication that had guided human affairs for so long was interrupted by the cosmic chaos that followed Osiris's death. But in this darkest hour, when it seemed that evil had triumphed permanently and that the forces of chaos would overwhelm all of creation, love would prove stronger than hatred and magic more powerful than treachery. The story of Osiris was far from over, and his death would ultimately lead not to the victory of chaos, but to an even greater demonstration of the power of divine love and the eternal nature of justice. Isis, devastated by the loss of her beloved husband, refused to accept his death as final. Her grief was like a force of nature itself, causing rivers to overflow their banks and desert storms to rage with unprecedented fury. Yet even in her overwhelming sorrow, the goddess retained the clarity of mind and strength of purpose that would enable her to achieve what seemed impossible. Her love for Osiris transcended the boundaries between life and death, and her magical knowledge gave her the tools she would need to challenge the finality of mortality itself. Her grief transformed into determination as Isis realized that mourning alone would not restore her beloved or repair the damage that Seth had done to the cosmic order. Drawing upon reserves of strength that surprised even herself, the goddess began to focus her considerable magical abilities on the task of finding Osiris's body and somehow reversing the effects of his murder. Her sorrow became a source of power, fueling spells and incantations that had never before been attempted by any deity. Using her formidable magical abilities, the goddess began a desperate search for Osiris's body, following the currents of the Nile and calling upon all the creatures of earth, water, and sky to aid her quest. Her journey took her far from Egypt, across treacherous waters and through foreign lands, but her love for Osiris never wavered. Every bird that flew overhead, every fish that swam in the river, every animal that walked the earth became her ally in the search for her beloved husband. The quest for Osiris's body became an epic journey that tested every aspect of Isis's divine nature. She traveled through regions where no Egyptian god had ever ventured, facing dangers and challenges that would have defeated lesser deities. Her determination never flagged. even when months passed without any sign of the sarcophagus or any clue to its location. The goddess pressed on through storms and calm, through day and night, driven by a love that refused to acknowledge defeat. The search led Isis to the ancient city of Byblos, a great trading center on the Mediterranean coast, where the currents had carried the sarcophagus after its long journey down the Nile and across the sea. The chest had washed ashore and become entangled in the roots of a great tamarisk tree that grew at the water's edge. The tree, nourished by the divine essence of the god trapped within the sarcophagus, had grown to enormous size with supernatural speed, its trunk swelling around the chest until it was completely enclosed within the living wood. The transformation of the tree was truly miraculous. In the space of a few short months, it had grown to a size that should have taken decades to achieve. Its trunk massive, and its canopy so broad that it provided shade for a significant area of the coastline. The wood itself seemed to glow with an inner light, and the tree's presence filled the surrounding area with an aura of peace and sanctity that was noticed by all who came near. The king of Byblos, amazed by the tree's supernatural growth and the sweet fragrance that emanated from its wood, had ordered it cut down and used as a pillar in his palace. The massive trunk was carefully transported to the royal residence, where it was installed as the centerpiece of the great hall. Not knowing that the pillar contained the body of a god, the king marveled at its beauty and the sense of divine presence it seemed to emanate. Visitors to the palace were invariably drawn to the pillar, sensing something extraordinary about the carved wood but unable to identify the source of its power. The installation of the pillar in the palace created an atmosphere of unusual peace and prosperity in the kingdom of Byblos. Disputes were settled more easily, crops grew more abundantly, and the people seemed happier and more content than they had ever been before. The king attributed this golden age to his own wise rule, never suspecting that the source of his kingdom's good fortune lay within the wooden pillar that graced his throne room. Isis, following the divine traces that only her magical sight could perceive, eventually arrived in Byblos disguised as an ordinary woman. Her divine nature was carefully concealed behind the appearance of a foreign traveler. Humble in dress, but carrying herself with a dignity that suggested noble birth in distant lands, the goddess understood that revealing her true identity too soon would complicate her mission, and she needed to find a way to approach the pillar that contained her beloved without arousing suspicion. Through a combination of magical persuasion and genuine charm, Isis gained employment in the royal household as a nursemaid to the king's infant son. Her apparent experience with children, combined with references that seemed to check out perfectly, convinced the queen to entrust her precious child to this mysterious but capable woman. Isis threw herself into the role with the dedication she brought to all her endeavors, caring for the infant with supernatural attention and devotion. Night after night, Isis tended to the royal child with care that went far beyond normal human capability, secretly conferring divine protection and the potential for immortality upon the baby. Using ancient magic that predated even the creation of Ra, she slowly began to burn away the child's mortal essence, replacing it with divine energy that would grant him eternal life and supernatural abilities. The process required perfect concentration and absolute secrecy, for any interruption could prove fatal to both the child and the magical working itself. The goddess's true nature was revealed one fateful evening when the queen, worried by the unusual behavior she had observed in her son's nursemaid, decided to spy on the woman during her nighttime ministrations. Hidden behind a curtain, the queen watched in horror as Isis held the baby over a blazing fire, the flames licking around the child's body without seeming to cause any harm. The sight was so shocking that the queen could not contain herself, and she burst from her hiding place with a scream of terror and rage. The interruption of the magical ritual had catastrophic consequences. The divine fire that was slowly transforming the child into an immortal being was suddenly extinguished, leaving the process incomplete and condemning the infant to a normal, mortal lifespan. Though he would live to become a great king in his own right, the child had lost his chance at true immortality, and the failure of the ritual caused Isis profound grief that added to her already overwhelming sorrow. Though the queen's interruption prevented the ritual's completion, she quickly recognized that she was in the presence of a goddess whose power far exceeded anything she had ever imagined. The divine radiance that suddenly blazed from Isis's form, the supernatural authority in her voice, and the sense of cosmic forces at work around her left no doubt that this was no ordinary woman, but a deity of immense power and importance. Falling to her knees in terror and awe, the queen begged for mercy and understanding, pleading for forgiveness for her interference and expressing her willingness to make any amends that the goddess might require. Her fear was mixed with genuine remorse, for she had begun to love the mysterious nursemaid and could see that her interruption had caused the woman profound distress. When Isis revealed her identity and explained her quest, the king and queen were both awed and terrified by the realization that they had been hosting one of the most powerful goddesses in the ancient world. The story of her search for her murdered husband moved them to tears, and they understood immediately that they had been chosen by fate to play a crucial role in one of the most important divine dramas ever enacted. Without hesitation, they immediately surrendered the pillar to the goddess, understanding that its true value far exceeded its worth as a decorative element in their palace. The king commanded his servants to carefully extract the pillar from its position, taking every precaution to ensure that no damage would come to the sacred wood or its precious contents. Isis, with tears of gratitude streaming down her divine face, used her magical powers to split open the pillar and extract the sarcophagus from within the tree's embrace. The moment her hands touched the chest that contained her beloved's body, she felt a surge of both hope and despair that nearly overwhelmed her divine composure. Hope, because she had finally found what she had searched for so desperately, and despair, because she could sense that Osiris's spirit had indeed departed from his physical form. The opening of the sarcophagus was a moment of both triumph and tragedy, as the heavy lid was lifted away, revealing Osiris's lifeless form preserved within. Isis's grief erupted like a volcanic explosion, her cries of anguish echoing across both the mortal and divine realms with such force that they were heard even in the deepest chambers of the underworld. Yet mixed with her grief was a determination that burned brighter than the sun itself, a refusal to accept that death could permanently separate her from her beloved husband. But Isis possessed power beyond measure, and her love for Osiris transcended even death itself. Drawing upon magical knowledge that she had acquired through years of study and divine inspiration, she began to work spells of restoration and renewal that had never before been attempted. Through her mastery of the deepest mysteries of life and death, she temporarily restored animation to her husband's body, calling his spirit back from the underworld for a brief but precious reunion. The magic required to restore life to Osiris, even temporarily, demanded everything that Isis possessed. She poured her own divine essence into the working, using her life force to kindle the spark of animation in her beloved's still form. The effort was so intense that it changed her fundamentally, deepening her connection to the mysteries of death and rebirth while also strengthening her mastery over the forces of life and magic. This miraculous restoration lasted just long enough for them to conceive a child who would carry forward their divine lineage and eventually avenge his father's murder. The union of Isis and the revived Osiris was both physical and spiritual, a merging of divine essences that created not just a new life, but a new hope for justice and the restoration of cosmic order. This child, conceived through love that conquered death itself and nurtured through magic more powerful than any previously known, was destined from the moment of conception to become one of the most important figures in Egyptian mythology. Born in the secret places of the Delta marshes and protected by powerful spells that concealed him from Seth's murderous intentions, this child was Horus, destined to become the avenger of his father and the rightful heir to the throne of Egypt. The birth of Horus took place in the most remote and protected areas of the Nile Delta, where the river split into countless channels and created a labyrinthine landscape of marshes, islands, and hidden waterways. Isis chose this location not only for its natural concealment, but also for its spiritual significance as a place where the boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead were thin and permeable. Seth, however, was not finished with his evil work. The Red God had seized the throne of Egypt after his brother's murder, ruling through fear and intimidation rather than the love and respect that had characterized Osiris's reign. His spies and servants scoured the land, searching for any trace of Isis or evidence that she might have survived her husband's death. When rumors reached him of a mysterious woman seen in foreign lands, Seth began to suspect that his sister-in-law had not only survived, but might be plotting against him. Discovering that Isis had found and hidden Osiris's body, the god of chaos flew into a murderous rage that shook the very foundations of his desert palace. The revelation that his perfect crime had been undone, that his brother's body had been recovered and possibly restored, filled him with a fury so intense that it manifested as supernatural storms that ravaged the land for days. Driven by paranoia and bloodlust, Seth located the hidden burial place where Isis had interred Osiris's restored corpse. Using his supernatural senses and the information provided by his network of spies and supernatural servants, he tracked down the secret tomb that the goddess had prepared for her husband. The discovery of the burial site confirmed Seth's worst fears and deepest suspicions about his sister-in-law's activities. In his fury, Seth committed an act of desecration so horrific that even his own followers were shocked by its brutality. He tore Osiris's carefully preserved body into 14 pieces, each dismemberment accompanied by curses and blasphemies that further corrupted the Red God's already twisted soul. The violence of the act was not just physical but spiritual, an attempt to destroy not just Osiris's earthly form, but his very essence as a divine being. Seth then scattered these pieces across the length and breadth of Egypt, from the Mediterranean coast to the cataracts of the southern Nile, ensuring that Osiris could never again be whole in the land of the living. Each piece was hidden in a different location, often in places that were difficult to reach, or heavily guarded by supernatural creatures loyal to Seth. The scattering was not random but carefully planned, with each piece placed in a location that would make the task of recovery as difficult and dangerous as possible. The symbolic significance of the 14 pieces reflected ancient Egyptian numerology and magical practice. The number 14 represented completion and cosmic wholeness, and Seth's division of his brother's body into this specific number of parts was an attempt to create a magical working that would prevent any possibility of resurrection or restoration. Once again, Isis embarked on a heartbreaking quest, this time searching for the scattered remains of her beloved throughout the entire kingdom of Egypt. The task seemed impossible, for the pieces had been hidden with supernatural cunning in locations that ranged from the depths of sacred lakes to the peaks of remote mountains. Yet Isis's determination remained unshaken, and her love for Osiris gave her the strength to persevere against seemingly insurmountable odds. With her sister Nephthys, the goddess of mourning and protection, who had finally turned against her own husband Seth in horror at his crimes, Isis traveled the entire length of Egypt using magic and divine sight to locate each fragment of Osiris's dismembered body. Nephthys's knowledge of Seth's methods and hiding places proved invaluable in the search, while her own magical abilities complemented those of Isis in powerful ways. The journey to recover the scattered pieces became an epic quest that tested every aspect of both goddesses' divine nature. They faced dangers that included not only the natural hazards of Egypt's diverse landscape, but also the supernatural guardians that Seth had placed to protect his grotesque trophies. Dragons in the depths of sacred pools, demons in desert caves, and spectral warriors in ancient ruins all stood between the goddesses and their goal. Where each fragment was found, Isis performed sacred rites and built a temple, creating a network of holy sites that would become centers of pilgrimage and worship for thousands of years to come. These temples served not only as monuments to Osiris's suffering and resurrection, but also as focal points for the magical energies that the goddess wove into the very fabric of the land itself. The establishment of these temples created a sacred geography that transformed Egypt into a giant magical working dedicated to the memory and ongoing spiritual presence of Osiris. Each shrine became a node in a vast network of spiritual power that connected the entire kingdom through invisible threads of divine energy, creating a protective web that would shield Egypt from the forces of chaos for millennia to come. The recovery of each piece was accompanied by specific rituals that not only honored Osiris, but also gradually restored his spiritual presence to the land. As Isis found and sanctified each fragment, the natural world began to respond with renewed vitality. Rivers flowed more clearly, crops grew more abundantly, and the people of Egypt felt a gradual lifting of the spiritual darkness that had oppressed them since their beloved god-king's murder. Through her extraordinary magical abilities, Isis succeeded in reassembling Osiris's body, missing only one piece that had been devoured by a fish in the Nile. The loss of this particular fragment would have permanent consequences for Osiris's relationship with the world of the living, symbolically severing his ability to father children in the conventional manner and marking his transition from a god of life to a deity of death and resurrection. The missing piece represented more than just physical incompleteness. It symbolized the fundamental change that death brings to all beings, even gods. Osiris could be restored to a form of life, but he could never again be exactly what he had been before his murder. This transformation would ultimately prove to be not a limitation, but a source of even greater power, as Osiris would become the ruler of a realm far vaster and more important than the kingdom of Egypt. With the help of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification who had been horrified by Seth's crimes and eager to help restore cosmic justice, and Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and magic whose knowledge of sacred formulas was unparalleled among the gods, Isis performed the very first mummification. This ritual would become the foundation of Egyptian burial practices, ensuring that mortals, too, could hope for resurrection and eternal life. The process of mummification that Isis developed was far more than simple preservation of the body. It was a complex magical working that prepared the deceased for transformation into a new form of existence. Every step of the procedure, from the removal and separate preservation of the organs to the wrapping and linen bandages imbued with protective spells, served both practical and spiritual purposes. Anubis brought to the restoration ritual his deep understanding of death and decay, knowledge that allowed him to preserve Osiris's reassembled form in a state that could support the return of divine life. His expertise in the mysteries of the afterlife made him an invaluable ally in the attempt to bridge the gap between death and resurrection. The jackal god's reverence for Osiris and his horror at Seth's desecration motivated him to share secrets of preservation that had never before been revealed to any other deity. Thoth contributed his mastery of language and magical formulas, crafting the words of power that would bind Osiris's spirit to his restored body and enable the god to function in his new role as ruler of the underworld. The ibis-headed god's vast learning included knowledge of the deepest mysteries of existence, and he drew upon this wisdom to create spells that would become the foundation of all subsequent Egyptian funerary magic. Together, the three deities wrapped Osiris's restored body in linen bandages that had been soaked in sacred oils and inscribed with hieroglyphs of protection and power. Each wrap was placed according to precise magical formulae, creating not just a preserved corpse, but a divine talisman of immense spiritual potency. The mummification process took 70 days to complete, a period that allowed the magical energies to fully integrate with the physical form. This ritual would become the foundation of Egyptian burial practices, offering hope to mortals that they too could achieve a form of eternal life through proper preparation of their earthly remains. The techniques developed by Isis, Anubis, and Thoth were carefully taught to human priests, creating a tradition of mortuary practice that would endure for thousands of years and spread throughout the ancient world. Though Osiris could not return to rule the living world, he was reborn as king of the afterlife, judging the souls of the dead and ensuring that justice prevailed even in the realm beyond mortal existence. His resurrection, achieved through love and magic, proved that death was not the end, but merely a transformation, a passage from one state of being to another that offered the possibility of continued existence and eventual reunion with loved ones. The transformation of Osiris from a god of the living to the ruler of the dead represented a fundamental shift in the cosmic order. His new role was arguably even more important than his previous position as king of Egypt, for while earthly rule affected only the living, dominion over the afterlife influenced every soul that had ever existed or would exist in the future. As Lord of the Underworld, Osiris established the Hall of Two Truths, where the souls of the deceased would face judgment based on their earthly deeds. This divine court became the ultimate arbiter of justice, ensuring that virtue was rewarded and evil punished according to cosmic law rather than earthly power or influence. The judgment of the dead was conducted with perfect fairness and complete knowledge of each soul's true nature. The myth of Osiris became the cornerstone of Egyptian religious belief, offering hope to all who faced the ultimate mystery of death. His story demonstrated that love could triumph over hatred, that justice would eventually prevail over injustice, and that death itself was not final, but merely a doorway to another form of existence. These teachings provided comfort to the bereaved and courage to those facing their own mortality. Meanwhile, young Horus grew to maturity in the hidden marshes of the Delta, protected by his mother's magic and trained in the arts of war and divine power. The education of the young god was comprehensive and intense, preparing him not only for his inevitable confrontation with Seth, but also for his future role as the divine prototype of Egyptian kingship. Isis taught him the full truth of his heritage. He was the son of the rightful king of Egypt, conceived through divine love, that had conquered death itself and destined to reclaim his father's throne and restore order to the world. The goddess shared with her son all her knowledge of magic, statecraft, and the complex relationships between gods and mortals that would be essential to his success as both avenger and ruler. The hidden refuge where Horus spent his childhood was more than just a place of concealment. It was a training ground where the young god learned to master his extraordinary abilities. Under his mother's guidance, he developed his shape-shifting powers, learning to transform between his human and falcon forms with perfect ease. He practiced aerial combat, magical warfare, and the subtle arts of divine diplomacy that would serve him well in his future dealings with the complex pantheon of Egyptian gods. As Horus matured, his divine nature manifested in extraordinary ways that even Isis found remarkable. His eyes blazed with the light of the sun and moon, reflecting his role as a sky god whose vision could penetrate any deception or illusion. His voice carried the authority of heaven itself, compelling obedience from lesser beings and inspiring courage in those who followed him. Most remarkably, his very presence seemed to restore order and harmony to his surroundings, causing plants to grow more vigorously and animals to behave more peacefully. The young god's form could shift between that of a man and a mighty falcon, with wings that could span the width of the Nile. In his human shape, he possessed the classic beauty of divine beings, with features that combined strength and nobility in perfect proportion. As a falcon, he was magnificent beyond description, his feathers gleaming like burnished metal, and his cry echoing with the power of divine authority. When Horus came of age, he appeared before the tribunal of the gods to claim his rightful inheritance. The divine court, presided over by Ra himself, listened as Horus presented his case with eloquence and passion that moved even the most skeptical deities. He was the legitimate son of Osiris, conceived through divine love and nurtured by the most powerful magic in existence. By all laws of succession, both divine and earthly, the throne of Egypt belonged to him, not to Seth, who had gained it through treachery and murder. The young god's argument was supported by compelling evidence and powerful witnesses. Isis testified to the circumstances of her son's conception and the magical rituals that had enabled Osiris to father a child even after his death. Anubis and Thoth confirmed the legitimacy of Horus's divine nature and his fitness to rule. Even Nephthys, despite her marriage to Seth, supported her nephew's claim, having been horrified by her husband's crimes and convinced of the justice of Horus's cause. The presentation of Horus's case was a masterpiece of divine rhetoric that demonstrated not only his legitimacy, but also his wisdom and understanding of cosmic law. The young god spoke with the authority of one who had been raised by Isis herself, displaying a knowledge of divine precedent and natural justice that impressed even the most senior members of the pantheon. Seth, however, would not surrender power without a fight. The Red God had enjoyed his reign as king of Egypt, ruling through fear and intimidation while expanding his influence throughout the divine hierarchy. The prospect of losing his stolen throne to his despised nephew filled him with rage and determination to maintain his position by any means necessary. The Red God argued that Horus was too young and inexperienced to rule, that his own strength and maturity made him the better choice to govern Egypt's turbulent forces. Seth claimed that his years on the throne had given him knowledge and wisdom that the young Horus could not possibly possess, and that changing rulers at this critical time would only bring chaos and instability to the kingdom. Seth's argument was carefully crafted to appeal to the gods' concerns about stability and order, He portrayed himself as the experienced administrator who had kept Egypt functioning despite the disruption caused by Osiris's death, while characterizing Horus as an untested youth whose idealism might prove dangerous in practice. The Red God's rhetoric was persuasive to some members of the divine tribunal, creating a division in opinion that would prolong the conflict. The god of chaos challenged Horus to a series of contests that would determine who was truly worthy to sit upon the throne of the pharaohs. These divine competitions would test not only physical strength, but wisdom, cunning, and the favor of the gods themselves. Seth proposed that rather than simply debating their respective claims, they should prove their worthiness through direct competition in various forms of divine challenge. The proposal for contests was accepted by the tribunal as a fair way to resolve the dispute, despite Isis's objections that her son was being forced to compete for what was rightfully his by inheritance. The gods reasoned that such trials would demonstrate clearly which claimant possessed the divine qualities necessary for effective rule, while also providing entertainment for the celestial court. The contests between Horus and Seth became the stuff of legend, epic struggles that shook the very foundations of creation and tested the limits of divine power. These competitions were witnessed by gods and mortals alike, with the outcome determining not just the rulership of Egypt, but the fundamental balance between order and chaos in the cosmic order. In one contest, they transformed themselves into hippopotamuses and battled beneath the waters of the Nile for 3 full months, their divine combat creating whirlpools and floods that threatened to overwhelm the entire delta region. The underwater battle was a test of endurance and aquatic warfare skills, with both gods using their shape-shifting abilities to gain advantages in the alien environment of the river depths. The hippopotamus forms chosen for this contest were particularly appropriate as these massive creatures were associated with both creative and destructive forces in Egyptian mythology. The battle beneath the waters symbolized the struggle between the life-giving power of the Nile and the destructive potential of uncontrolled flooding, with Horus representing beneficial order and Seth embodying chaotic destruction. During the underwater combat, both gods displayed incredible stamina and ferocity, their clashes creating disturbances that were felt throughout the length of the Nile. Fish fled from the areas where they fought, while the violence of their combat caused the river itself to change course in several locations. Only the intervention of other gods prevented their battle from permanently altering the geography of Egypt. In another contest, they raced across the desert in boats made of stone, defying the laws of nature through sheer divine will and determination. This challenge tested their ability to overcome impossible obstacles through magical power and creative thinking, as navigating stone vessels across sand dunes required both supernatural strength and innovative problem-solving skills. The stone boat race became a legendary demonstration of divine ingenuity and power. Horus chose to craft his vessel from a single piece of limestone, using his divine breath to make it light enough to skim across the sand like a bird in flight. Seth, in contrast, created his boat from volcanic rock, relying on brute force and the heat of his desert nature to melt a path through the sand as he traveled. The race covered hundreds of miles of desert terrain, with both gods pushing their vassals and themselves to the limits of endurance. Horus relied on his connection to the winds and his falcon nature to give his boat lift and speed, while Seth used his mastery of desert storms to create favorable conditions for his passage. The contest was so close that it ended in what appeared to be a tie, with both gods reaching the finish line at virtually the same moment. Perhaps the most famous of their contests involves Seth's attempt to prove his dominance through an act of sexual violence, a challenge that revealed the depths of his depravity and the extent of his willingness to use any means to maintain power. In the darkness of night, Seth attacked Horus, seeking to humiliate and claim him in a manner that would establish his dominance before the divine court. This particular contest was based on the ancient belief that sexual dominance could establish political and social superiority, with the penetrating partner gaining authority over the penetrated one. Seth's plan was to force himself upon Horus and then claim before the gods that he had proven his superiority through this act of sexual conquest. But Horus, warned by his mother's wisdom and protected by her magic, was prepared for his uncle's treacherous attack. Isis had foreseen this possibility and had taught her son how to defend himself against such an assault, while turning the tables on his attacker. Through cunning and divine power, Horus ensured that Seth's seed fell not upon him, but upon the ground, while secretly placing his own divine essence upon lettuce that Seth would later consume, unknowingly ingesting the evidence of his own defeat. The magical preparations that enabled Horus to thwart Seth's attack were complex and sophisticated, involving protective spells that created illusions and diversions while allowing the young god to gather the evidence he would need to prove his victory. Isis's magical expertise was crucial to this success, as she had anticipated Seth's tactics and prepared appropriate countermeasures. When the gods convened to judge the outcome of this particularly disturbing contest, both Seth and Horus claimed victory. The atmosphere in the divine court was tense and uncomfortable, as even the gods were troubled by the sexual nature of the competition and its implications for divine dignity and honor. Seth boasted that he had dominated his nephew, claiming that his physical superiority and successful assault proved his fitness to rule over the younger god. The red god's arrogance and crude descriptions of his supposed victory disgusted many of the assembled deities, but some were inclined to accept his claim, based on traditional beliefs about sexual dominance and political authority. But when the gods called forth Seth's seed to testify to the truth of his claims, it answered not from within Horus, but from the mud of the riverbank where it had fallen harmlessly. The divine essence spoke with a voice that all could hear, confirming that Seth had not achieved the dominance he claimed, and had, in fact, been deceived by illusions created through Horus's superior magical abilities. When they called for Horus's seed, it responded from within Seth himself, speaking from the red god's stomach, where it had taken root after he unknowingly consumed the tainted lettuce. The voice proclaimed Horus's supremacy before the entire divine assembly, providing undeniable proof that the young god had not only defended himself successfully, but had actually turned the tables on his attacker. The revelation that Seth had been the one who was ultimately dominated in this contest caused great embarrassment to the red god and shifted opinion in the divine court decisively toward Horus. The testimony of the divine essence itself could not be disputed or dismissed, and even Seth's supporters were forced to acknowledge that their champion had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. The battles continued for 80 years, each contest more elaborate and dangerous than the last, testing every aspect of divine power and knowledge. The gods themselves grew weary of the conflict, recognizing that the stability of both heaven and earth depended upon reaching a just resolution. The prolonged nature of the contest was beginning to disrupt the normal functioning of the cosmos, as the attention and energy of the major deities were consumed by judging and managing the ongoing competition. Some favored Seth for his strength and experience, appreciating his raw power and his years of administrative experience as king of Egypt. These gods argued that leadership required the hard-earned wisdom that came from actually wielding power in difficult circumstances, and they worried that Horus's idealism might prove inadequate when faced with the practical challenges of governing a complex kingdom. Others supported Horus's legitimate claim as Osiris's rightful heir, believing that justice and proper succession were more important than practical considerations. These deities argued that allowing Seth to profit from his crimes would set a dangerous precedent that could destabilize the entire divine order, encouraging future acts of treachery and violence among the gods. The divine court was split almost evenly, creating a deadlock that seemed impossible to resolve through normal deliberation. As the contests continued without producing a clear victor, some gods began to suggest that perhaps Egypt should be divided between the two claimants, with each ruling a portion of the kingdom according to his particular strengths and domains. Finally, it was Osiris himself who broke the deadlock. Speaking from the underworld with the voice of ultimate authority, the resurrected god-king declared that his son Horus was the rightful heir to the throne of Egypt. His words carried special weight because he spoke not as a partisan supporter, but as the legitimate former king whose throne was in dispute. Osiris reminded the divine assembly that Seth had gained power through murder and treachery, crimes that could not be legitimized by the passage of time or demonstrations of strength. The former king pointed out that accepting Seth's rule would essentially reward his evil actions and send a message that violence and deceit were acceptable means of gaining power. Justice demanded that the legitimate heir be restored to his birthright, and the natural order required that Seth answer for his terrible crimes rather than profit from them. Osiris's argument was compelling because it addressed not just the immediate question of succession, but the broader principles that governed divine and mortal society. The intervention of Osiris from the underworld was accompanied by supernatural phenomena that emphasized the gravity of his words. The earth trembled as he spoke, the Nile rose in its banks, and a wind arose that carried the scent of the afterlife, reminding all present of the reality of death and judgment that awaited even the gods. Faced with the judgment of Osiris and the growing consensus among the gods, the divine tribunal finally rendered its verdict. The weight of the former king's testimony, combined with the evidence of Horus's victories in the contests and the growing revulsion at Seth's methods, created an overwhelming case for the young god's legitimacy. Horus was declared the rightful king of Egypt, destined to rule over the living world while his father Osiris governed the realm of the dead. This division of authority established a cosmic balance that would endure for millennia, with the living and the dead each having their proper ruler and domain. Seth, stripped of his usurped authority, was sentenced to eternal exile in the desert, where he would rule over storms and chaos but never again threaten the civilized world. The Red God's punishment was both just and practical, removing him from positions where he could cause further harm while acknowledging his legitimate role as a force of nature that served necessary functions in the cosmic order. The sentencing of Seth marked the end of the great contest and the restoration of legitimate rule to Egypt. The Red God's exile to the desert was not just punishment, but also a recognition that chaotic forces, while dangerous, played an essential role in maintaining cosmic balance by providing challenges that strengthened order and justice. The coronation of Horus marked the beginning of a new age for Egypt. The young god-king took his place upon the throne with wisdom beyond his years, guided by his mother's counsel and blessed with his father's sense of justice. His rule combined the compassion and wisdom of Osiris with the magical knowledge of Isis and the courage needed to face the challenges that lay ahead. Under Horus's rule, the Nile resumed its life-giving floods after years of irregularity caused by the cosmic imbalance of Seth's usurpation. The crops grew abundant once more, the people prospered, and peace returned to the land. The rightful order of creation had been restored, and Egypt entered an era of prosperity that would last for countless generations. The new king's first acts included the establishment of festivals honoring his father Osiris, and the formal recognition of Isis as the Queen Mother, whose wisdom would guide royal policy. Horus also pardoned many of Seth's followers who had served the usurper out of fear rather than malice, demonstrating a magnanimity that won him widespread support among both gods and mortals. But the pantheon of Egypt contained many other deities whose stories intertwined with those of the great gods we have already encountered. Among the most beloved and revered was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the guardian of the necropolis. His role in the resurrection of Osiris had established him as one of the most important figures in Egyptian religion, and his continued service to the dead made him a crucial link between the worlds of the living and the dead. Anubis played a crucial role in the resurrection of Osiris, using his divine knowledge to perfect the art of preserving the dead. His black skin symbolized the color of mummified flesh and the fertile soil of the Nile, connecting death and rebirth in the eternal cycle of Egyptian religion. The jackal god's understanding of decomposition and preservation was unparalleled, making him an invaluable ally in the effort to restore Osiris to a form of life. The origins of Anubis were themselves the subject of various myths, with some traditions making him the son of Osiris and Nephthys, conceived during a moment of confusion when Nephthys disguised herself as Isis. This parentage would make Anubis both the half-brother of Horus and the nephew of Seth, positioning him uniquely within the divine family dynamics that shaped Egyptian mythology. As the psychopomp who guided souls through the dangerous journey of the afterlife, Anubis served as both protector and judge of the dead. His role extended far beyond simple guidance, encompassing the complex magical and spiritual processes that determined whether a soul could successfully navigate the perils of the underworld and achieve eternal life. In the Hall of Two Truths, where the souls of mortals faced their final judgment, Anubis oversaw the weighing of the heart ceremony with meticulous care and absolute impartiality. The deceased's heart, believed to contain the record of their earthly deeds, was placed upon a scale opposite the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. This ceremony was the culmination of the soul's journey through death, and the ultimate test of their worthiness for eternal life. If the heart was lighter than the feather, proving that the soul was free from the weight of sin and wrongdoing, the deceased was deemed worthy of eternal life in the blessed fields of the afterlife. Such souls would join the company of the righteous dead and eventually achieve a form of divine status themselves, becoming part of the eternal order that sustained creation. If the heart was heavier than the feather, weighed down by unrepented sins and evil deeds, it would be devoured by Amit, the crocodile-headed monster who consumed the unworthy. This second death was final and absolute, representing the complete destruction of the soul and the end of all possibility for continued existence. Anubis's role in this process was crucial, as his supernatural senses could detect any attempt to deceive the scales or manipulate the outcome of the judgment. The jackal god's integrity was absolute, and his loyalty to justice made him incorruptible, despite the desperate pleas and offered bribes of souls who knew they faced damnation. Anubis's role extended far beyond the judgment of souls. He was the master of the embalming process, the divine patron of the priests who prepared bodies for their eternal journey. Every step of mummification, from the removal of organs to the wrapping in sacred bandages, was performed under his watchful protection. The techniques he had developed with Isis for the restoration of Osiris became the foundation of human mortuary practice, ensuring that even common people could hope for preservation and resurrection. The canopic jars that held the deceased's preserved organs were placed under the guardianship of Anubis's 4 sons, each responsible for protecting a different aspect of the body's preservation. Imseti protected the liver, Duamutef guarded the stomach, Hapi watched over the lungs, and Kibasanuef protected the intestines. These 4 gods were often depicted as human-headed, baboon-headed, falcon-headed, and jackal-headed respectively, representing different aspects of the preservation process. The origin of Anubis's distinctive form reflected the ancient Egyptians' deep understanding of the natural world and their ability to transform potentially frightening images into sources of protection and comfort. Jackals and wild dogs were commonly seen in cemeteries, scavenging among the graves, and the Egyptians transformed this potentially frightening image into a protective deity who watched over the dead with fierce devotion. Rather than seeing the presence of jackals in cemeteries as an ominous sign, the ancient Egyptians interpreted it as evidence that these creatures were natural guardians of the dead. Anubis's canine nature was believed to give him supernatural senses that could detect spiritual corruption and protect the deceased from the various demons and evil spirits that threaten souls during their journey through the underworld. Anubis's keen senses, symbolized by his canine nature, allowed him to detect the spiritual corruption that might threaten a soul's journey to the afterlife, making him an invaluable guardian in the realm of the dead. His ability to see through deception and illusion made him particularly effective at identifying souls who attempted to hide their true nature from divine judgment. Stories of Anubis often portrayed him as a figure of unwavering loyalty and dedication, qualities that made him beloved by both gods and mortals. His devotion to duty was legendary, and he was known never to abandon his post or neglect his responsibilities, regardless of the personal cost or the magnitude of the challenges he faced. When Osiris was murdered by Seth, it was Anubis who first discovered the crime and alerted Isis to her husband's fate. The jackal god's supernatural senses had detected the wrongness in the cosmic order immediately after Seth's treacherous act, and his investigation revealed the full extent of the red god's crime. This discovery began the chain of events that would eventually lead to justice for Osiris and the restoration of rightful order. Throughout the goddess's quest to find and resurrect her beloved, Anubis served as her faithful companion, using his supernatural senses to track the scattered remains and his divine knowledge to perfect the rituals of restoration. His loyalty to the family of Osiris was absolute, and he risked the wrath of Seth by openly supporting Isis in her efforts to undo the Red God's evil work. The partnership between Anubis and Isis during the search for Osiris's body created one of the most powerful alliances in Egyptian mythology. The goddess's magical knowledge, combined with the jackal god's tracking abilities and understanding of death, made them a formidable team that even Seth could not entirely thwart, despite his best efforts to prevent his brother's restoration. His devotion to the family of Osiris exemplified the loyalty that Egyptians valued above all other virtues, and his willingness to risk everything for the sake of justice made him a model of moral behavior that influenced Egyptian ethics for thousands of years. The stories of his faithful service became templates for human behavior, showing mortals how dedication and loyalty could triumph over even the most powerful forces of evil. In stark contrast to the solemn majesty of Anubis stood Bastet, the cat goddess, whose dual nature embodied both nurturing protection and fierce lioness-like rage. Her evolution from a lioness deity to a cat-headed goddess reflected the changing relationship between humans and felines in ancient Egypt, as well as the goddess's own development from a fierce warrior to a more approachable protector of home and family. Originally depicted as a lioness, Bastet gradually evolved into the more familiar cat-headed deity beloved by millions of Egyptians throughout the kingdom's long history. This transformation was not arbitrary, but reflected genuine changes in Egyptian society and religion as the kingdom became more stable and domestic concerns gained importance relative to military conquest and defense against foreign enemies. Her transformation from lioness to domestic cat reflected the changing relationship between humans and felines, as cats became treasured companions and protectors of Egyptian households. The domestication of cats in Egypt was closely linked to the development of agriculture and the need to protect stored grain from rodents, making these animals valuable allies in the struggle for survival and prosperity. The lioness aspect of Bastet represented her original role as a fierce warrior goddess who protected Egypt from its enemies through military might and divine wrath. In this form, she was associated with the scorching heat of the sun and the destructive power of divine anger, capable of reducing entire armies to ash through her supernatural fury. As cats became more common in Egyptian households, Bastet's image gradually softened to reflect their more gentle and nurturing qualities. The domestic cat's role as a protector of homes and families made it a natural symbol for a goddess whose primary concern was the welfare of ordinary people rather than the grand conflicts that occupied other deities. Baste's primary domain was the protection of the home, family, and especially women and children. As a goddess of fertility and motherhood, she watched over expectant mothers and blessed families with healthy offspring. Her gentle, nurturing aspect made her one of the most approachable deities in the Egyptian pantheon, and common people felt comfortable bringing their everyday concerns and prayers to her temples. The accessibility of Bastet to ordinary worshippers was one of her most appealing characteristics. Unlike the remote, awe-inspiring figures of Ra or Osiris, who were revered from a distance, Bastet was seen as a goddess who truly understood and cared about the daily struggles of mortal existence. Her temples were places where common people could seek help with practical problems like illness, domestic disputes, and concerns about their children's welfare. The goddess's association with fertility made her particularly important to women, who often prayed to her for help conceiving children, for protection during pregnancy and childbirth, and for guidance in raising their offspring. Bastet's own mythical role as a mother goddess gave her special insight into the challenges and joys of parenthood, making her prayers especially effective in matters related to family life. But her protection extended beyond humans to include all the small, vulnerable creatures that needed divine guardianship. House cats, kittens, and even mice and birds were considered to be under her special protection, and harming these creatures was believed to invite her wrath. This protective aspect made Bastet beloved by children, who saw in her a divine advocate for the weak and defenseless. Yet beneath her gentle exterior lay the heart of a lioness, and when her protected charges faced danger, Bastet could transform into a fearsome warrior goddess whose wrath was terrible to behold. Her eyes would blaze like the sun, her claws would extend like curved daggers, and her roar would shake the very foundations of creation. This dual nature made Bastet a particularly complex and fascinating deity, embodying the Egyptian understanding that true protection required both nurturing love and the willingness to fight fiercely when necessary. The transformation of Bastet from her gentle cat form to her fierce lioness aspect was dramatic and terrifying. Those who threatened her protected charges would find themselves facing not a domestic pet, but a supernatural predator whose power rivaled that of the greatest warrior gods. Her retribution was swift and merciless, and stories of her vengeance served as powerful warnings against harming those under her protection. This dual nature reflected the ancient Egyptian understanding that motherhood and protection required both tender care and fierce defense. A mother cat's willingness to fight to the death to protect her kittens became a symbol of the divine love that would stop at nothing to ensure the safety of the innocent and vulnerable. The balance between Bastet's gentle and fierce aspects made her one of the most psychologically complex deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Worshippers understood that her love was accompanied by the capacity for terrible wrath, and this knowledge both comforted and sobered those who sought her protection. Her worship of Bastet centered on the city of Bubastes in the Nile Delta, where her massive temple complex hosted one of the most joyous festivals in the ancient world. The temple itself was a marvel of Egyptian architecture, featuring gardens filled with plants sacred to the goddess and courtyards where thousands of cats lived under the care of her priests. During the annual celebration of Bastet, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims would travel from across Egypt to honor the cat goddess with music, dancing, and elaborate processions. The festival was renowned for its atmosphere of celebration and liberation, with participants temporarily setting aside the normal constraints of social hierarchy to revel in the goddess's benevolent presence. The festival of Bastet was unlike any other religious celebration in ancient Egypt. While most divine festivals were solemn affairs focused on worship and sacrifice, Bastet's celebration was characterized by joy, music, and a sense of liberation from everyday concerns. Pilgrims would arrive by boat, singing and playing musical instruments as they traveled up the Nile toward Bubastis. The festival featured elaborate processions in which the goddess's sacred cats were paraded through the streets on decorated litters, accompanied by priests chanting hymns and devotees dancing to the rhythm of drums and sistrums. The cats themselves were treated as divine beings, adorned with jewelry and perfumed with sacred oils as they were carried through the cheering crowds. Beer and wine flowed freely during the celebration, and the normal rules governing social behavior were relaxed to allow for greater freedom of expression. The festival created a temporary inversion of social order that was believed to please Bastet and demonstrate the joy and liberation that her protection could bring to mortal life. Cats themselves were considered sacred to Bastet, and the killing of a cat, even accidentally, was punishable by death under Egyptian law. This legal protection reflected the deep religious significance of these animals and the belief that harming them was tantamount to attacking the goddess herself. The extreme nature of this punishment demonstrated just how seriously the Egyptians took their religious obligations and how completely cats had become integrated into their spiritual worldview. When a household cat died, the family would go into mourning, shaving their eyebrows as a sign of grief, and mummifying their feline companion with the same care given to human family members. The mourning process for cats followed many of the same rituals used for human deaths, including specific periods of lamentation and the wearing of special garments that indicated the family's loss. The mummification of cats became an elaborate industry in ancient Egypt, with specialized priests and embalmers devoted entirely to the proper preservation of these sacred animals. The process was expensive and time-consuming, involving the same careful removal of organs, treatment with natron salt, and wrapping in linen bandages that was used for human mummies. Thousands of mummified cats have been discovered in Egyptian tombs and dedicated cat cemeteries, testament to the profound respect and love that ancient Egyptians felt for these divine creatures. Some of these feline mummies were buried with elaborate grave goods, including bowls of milk, toy mice, and jewelry, suggesting that their owners believed the cats would need these items in the afterlife. The cat cemeteries of ancient Egypt were vast underground complexes that housed hundreds of thousands of mummified felines. These sites became pilgrimage destinations where devotees of Bastet could come to honor their deceased pets and seek the goddess's blessing for their living companions. The sheer scale of these burial grounds demonstrates the central role that cats played in Egyptian religious and domestic life. Beyond individual household cats, the temples of Bastet maintained large populations of sacred cats that were believed to be direct manifestations of the goddess herself. These temple cats were cared for by specialized priests and lived lives of luxury and privilege, fed the finest foods, and housed in elaborate quarters designed specifically for their comfort. The temple cats served various religious functions, from participating in ceremonies to providing oracles through their behavior patterns. Priests trained in interpreting feline behavior could read messages from Bastet in the way her sacred cats moved, ate, slept, or interacted with visitors to the temple. The interconnected stories of these great deities created a rich tapestry of meaning that guided Egyptian civilization for over 3,000 years. Each god and goddess represented not just supernatural power, but fundamental aspects of human experience that remained constant across cultures and centuries. The myths provided a framework for understanding the world that was both practical and spiritual, offering guidance for everything from agricultural practices to moral behavior. The struggle between order and chaos, embodied in the conflict between Osiris and Seth, reflected the eternal human challenge of building and maintaining civilization in the face of destructive forces. This theme resonated with people who lived in a land where the life-giving Nile could also bring devastating floods, and where the fertile valley was surrounded by harsh desert that could reclaim cultivated land in a single sandstorm. The hope for life after death, demonstrated through Osiris's resurrection and the elaborate mummification practices that followed his example, addressed one of humanity's deepest fears and most enduring questions. The Egyptian answer to mortality was not acceptance of oblivion, but the promise of continued existence for those who lived justly and prepared properly for the transition from life to death. The importance of justice and protection, represented by figures like Anubis and Bastet, reflected the fundamental human need for security and fairness in an uncertain world. These deities offered both supernatural protection and moral guidance, showing mortals how to create societies based on law, compassion, and mutual care. The cycles of nature and fertility, embodied in the seasonal death and rebirth of Osiris and the protective nurturing of Bastet, provided explanations for natural phenomena while also offering hope that periods of hardship and loss were temporary rather than permanent. The agricultural metaphors that ran through Egyptian mythology made these abstract concepts concrete and relevant to people whose survival depended on understanding natural cycles. The influence of these divine figures extended far beyond religious worship into every aspect of Egyptian society, creating a civilization that was thoroughly integrated around shared spiritual beliefs and values. The myths were not just stories told in temples, but living principles that shaped law, art, architecture, politics, and daily life throughout the kingdom. Pharaohs claimed direct descent from Horus, legitimizing their rule through divine connection and establishing a link between earthly and heavenly authority that endured for thousands of years. This divine kingship was not merely symbolic, but practical, as it provided a stable foundation for government and a source of legitimacy that transcended the personal qualities of individual rulers. The concept of divine kingship meant that pharaohs were not just political leaders, but spiritual intermediaries between the gods and mortals. Their role included maintaining cosmic order through proper performance of religious rituals, ensuring justice through fair administration of law, and protecting Egypt through both military and magical means. The elaborate burial practices inspired by Osiris's resurrection ensured that Egypt developed the most sophisticated mortuary culture in the ancient world, creating industries and practices that employed thousands of people and produced some of humanity's most enduring monuments. The pyramids, tombs, and mummies that fascinate us today were all products of religious beliefs that originated in the myths of divine death and resurrection. The Egyptian mortuary industry included not just the obvious professions of embalmers and tomb builders, but also artists, craftsmen, farmers who grew the crops needed to feed workers, miners who extracted the materials used in construction, and countless others whose livelihoods depended on the elaborate preparations for the afterlife. The protective aspects of Anubis and Bastet influenced everything from home design to military strategy, as Egyptians sought to invoke divine protection in all their endeavors. Houses were built with shrines to protective deities, amulets bearing divine images were worn for protection, and military campaigns were planned around religious calendars and divine omens. Egyptian art and architecture incorporated religious symbolism at every level, from the grand temples that dominated city skylines to the humble household objects decorated with images of protective gods. This integration of the sacred and mundane created a visual culture that constantly reminded people of their connection to the divine realm. The legal system of ancient Egypt was deeply influenced by religious concepts of justice and cosmic order, with laws designed not just to maintain social stability, but to reflect divine will and ensure that earthly justice mirrored heavenly principles. Courts often consulted oracles and priestly interpretations of divine law when making difficult decisions. The economic system was also shaped by religious beliefs, with temple complexes serving as major centers of production, trade, and wealth redistribution. The gods were not just spiritual entities, but economic actors who owned vast estates, employed thousands of workers, and participated in trade relationships that spanned the ancient world. As we contemplate these timeless stories, we find in them reflections of our own hopes, fears, and aspirations that transcend the boundaries of culture and time. The human condition, with all its struggles and triumphs, is laid bare in these ancient narratives that continue to speak to us across the millennia. The triumph of Horus over Seth speaks to our desire to see justice prevail over cruelty and our belief that righteousness will ultimately overcome evil, even when the forces of chaos seem temporarily ascendant. This theme resonates with modern audiences who continue to struggle against injustice and corruption in their own societies. The love of Isis for Osiris demonstrates the power of devotion to overcome even death itself, offering hope to all who have experienced loss, and showing that love transcends the physical boundaries of existence. Their story has inspired countless works of art, literature, and music throughout history, proving the universal appeal of love that conquers all obstacles. The protective nature of Anubis and Bastet reflects our need to feel safe and cared for in an uncertain world, while their roles as guardians of justice and family show how divine protection operates through moral principles rather than arbitrary favoritism. These deities model the kind of care and protection that humans strive to provide for each other. The figure of Ra as creator and supreme deity addresses fundamental questions about the origin and purpose of existence, providing a framework for understanding our place in the cosmic order. His role as both distant creator and involved ruler offers a model of divine authority that balances transcendence with immanence. These ancient myths continue to resonate because they address the fundamental questions that have always haunted human existence. What happens when we die? How do we distinguish right from wrong? What forces protect us from the chaos that threatens to destroy everything we hold dear? Why do we suffer? And how can we find meaning in our struggles? The Egyptian answers to these eternal questions were sophisticated and nuanced, acknowledging the complexity of existence while offering hope and guidance for navigating life's challenges. Their gods were not perfect beings who lived in serene isolation, but complex characters who faced many of the same struggles as mortals, making them more relatable and their wisdom more applicable to human experience. The psychological insights embedded in these myths reveal a deep understanding of human nature that remains relevant today. The jealousy of Seth, the grief of Isis, the determination of Horus, and the loyalty of Anubis are emotions and qualities that we recognize in ourselves and others, making these ancient stories feel immediate and personal. The gods of Egypt were more than mere objects of worship. They were teachers, protectors, and guides who helped an entire civilization understand its place in the cosmic order and develop strategies for thriving in a challenging world. Their stories provided both practical wisdom and spiritual comfort, addressing the full range of human needs and concerns. Their stories, preserved in hieroglyphs and passed down through countless generations, remind us that the search for meaning, purpose, and divine connection is as old as humanity itself, and as relevant today as it was 5,000 years ago. The methods of preserving and transmitting these stories demonstrate the importance that ancient peoples placed on maintaining cultural continuity and passing wisdom to future generations. In the tales of Ra, Horus, Osiris, Seth, Anubis, and Bastet, we discover not just the mythology of ancient Egypt, but the eternal struggles and aspirations that define the human experience across all cultures and all ages. These stories serve as bridges connecting us to our ancestors and helping us understand the common threads that run through all human experience. The enduring popularity of Egyptian mythology in modern culture, from literature and film to art and popular religion, demonstrates that these ancient stories still have the power to inspire, comfort, and guide us. They offer timeless wisdom wrapped in compelling narratives that continue to captivate new generations of readers and viewers. These divine narratives formed the backbone of Egyptian religious thought, providing both explanation and inspiration for a civilization that would endure longer than any other in human history. The stability and longevity of Egyptian culture can be attributed in large part to the strong foundation provided by these shared beliefs and the values they promoted. The wisdom embedded in these myths guided pharaohs and peasants alike, offering hope for the afterlife while providing practical guidance for earthly existence. The democratic nature of Egyptian afterlife beliefs, which offered immortality to all who lived justly, regardless of social status, created a society with shared values and common goals. In their eternal struggles and triumphs, these gods and goddesses became the immortal embodiment of human values, fears, and dreams, ensuring that their stories would continue to captivate and inspire long after the last pharaoh had been laid to rest in the Valley of the Kings. They represent humanity's ongoing attempts to understand the divine and to find meaning in the face of mortality and uncertainty. The legacy of these deities extends far beyond ancient Egypt, influencing religious and philosophical traditions throughout the ancient world and continuing to inspire spiritual seekers today. Their stories have been retold and reinterpreted countless times, each generation finding new meanings and applications for these timeless narratives. As we face our own challenges and uncertainties in the modern world, we can still find wisdom and comfort in these ancient stories. They remind us that the struggle between order and chaos, the power of love and loyalty, and the hope for justice and protection are eternal aspects of the human condition that transcend time and culture. The gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt continue to live in our collective imagination, their stories serving as a bridge between the ancient and modern worlds and demonstrating the enduring power of myth to illuminate the deepest truths about human existence. In their tales of love and betrayal, justice and vengeance, death and resurrection, we find reflections of our own lives and aspirations that speak to the timeless nature of human experience. Through understanding these ancient deities and their stories, we gain insight not only into one of history's greatest civilizations, but also into ourselves and the universal human quest for meaning, purpose, and connection to something greater than our individual existence. The myths of Ra, Horus, Osiris, Seth, Anubis, and Bastet remain as relevant and powerful today as they were when they first emerged from the fertile imagination of the ancient Egyptian people, proving that some truths are indeed eternal and some stories will never lose their power to move and inspire the human heart